Babylon. Imagine standing in the dust of Iraq, staring at broken bricks under a white-hot sky, while someone tells you these ruins belong to the most famous city on earth, a city of impossible walls, a city of blue gates and lion-lined roads, a city of kings who spoke as if the gods themselves had handed them the right to rule the world. And yet, the deeper you look into Babylon, the stranger it becomes, because the Babylon people remember most vividly is not the same Babylon whose ruins still lie in the ground. Its legend was born in one age, its stones in another. In a way, Babylon became myth before it became memory. That is what makes this city so gripping. Babylon is not just the story of a place. It is the story of reinvention, of a city that rose from obscurity, absorbed the violence of empires, and learned how to turn power into spectacle. Before Babylon became the city of Nebuchadnezzar, before the Ishtar Gate flashed blue in the sun, before foreign kings dreamed of conquering it, it was just one more settlement in the muddy, dangerous world between the Tigris and Euphrates. Small, vulnerable, easy to overlook. And that may be the most important part of the whole story, because Babylon did not begin as history's greatest city. It began as a place most people would have walked right past. Its earliest known mentions appear in the Akkadian period, under the later king Shar-Kali-Shari in the 23rd century BCE, when Babylon was still a minor place, nowhere near the center of Mesopotamian power. The very name later associated with it, Gate of God, carried a grandeur the city had not yet earned. To understand why Babylon's rise was so extraordinary, you have to step into Mesopotamia before Babylon mattered. This was not a peaceful cradle of civilization glowing with calm wisdom. It was a hard, competitive landscape of canals, walls, temples, taxes, and war. City fought city. Dynasties rose fast and vanished faster. Great names like Sumer and Akkad had already shaped the region, and long before Babylon reached its height, the Akkadian Empire had shown what imperial ambition looked like in this world. Sargon of Akkad had built one of history's earliest empires in the 23rd century BCE, stretching his authority across much of Mesopotamia. But empires in this land were always fragile. Pressure from outside groups, internal revolts, and the endless strain of holding distant cities together could crack even the strongest kingdom. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the political order that had dominated the region was breaking apart. The old imperial frame weakened, and Mesopotamia became a fractured arena where rival states maneuvered, betrayed, and attacked one another with relentless energy. In that instability, small cities could disappear, but sometimes, under the right leader, they could also become something far greater. Babylon's opening came with the Amorites, Western Semitic groups who spread through Mesopotamia as older powers declined. By around 1900 BCE, Amorite dynasties had taken control across much of the region, and Babylon passed into their hands. This is where the city's real story begins to sharpen. An Amorite ruler named Sumu Abum, traditionally dated to around the late 19th century BCE, is associated with establishing Babylon's first ruling dynasty. That matters because dynasties do more than hold thrones. They create continuity. They turn a city from a stop on a map into the seat of a political project. Babylon under Sumu Abum was still not the giant that would later dominate the imagination of the ancient world, but it was no longer drifting in the current of stronger neighbors. It had begun to define itself. Defensive works, local consolidation, and the slow expansion of influence gave the city a backbone. What had once been a lesser port settlement, overshadowed by older cities, was learning how to survive in a brutal neighborhood. That is often how greatness starts in history, not with glory, but with the simple refusal to be swallowed. Still, we should not romanticize early Babylon too quickly. When Hammurabi was born, Babylon was not yet the unquestioned master of Mesopotamia. It was one kingdom among many, and not even the most intimidating one. To its south and east stood other powers with deeper roots or greater immediate strength. To the north, competing states and ambitious rulers watched every border. This was a chessboard, and every kingdom was moving pieces while pretending to offer peace. Hammurabi, the sixth ruler of Babylon's first dynasty, inherited not a world empire but a precarious position. Britannica dates his reign to about 1792 to 1750 BCE, and what makes his career so astonishing is how completely he transformed Babylon's status within a single lifetime. When he came to the throne, Babylon was a minor power. By the time he died, it had become the capital of a sprawling realm and the political center of Mesopotamia. That shift is so dramatic that it can make Babylon's rise feel inevitable in hindsight. It was not. It was the achievement of a ruler who knew when to build, when to negotiate, and when to strike. And that is where the story starts to turn from survival into design. Hammurabi did not burst onto the scene like a conqueror swinging a sword in every direction. Early in his reign, he seems to have focused on strengthening his kingdom from within. This is one of the details people often miss because conquest makes better headlines than administration. But the truth is that empires are usually won twice, first in infrastructure, then on the battlefield. Hammurabi invested in walls, temples, and canals. In Mesopotamia, canals were not some background engineering detail, they were lifelines. They controlled irrigation, agriculture, movement, taxation, and the very rhythm of survival. A king who repaired canals was not doing side work. He was shaping the bloodstream of his state. So before Hammurabi made Babylon feared, he made it functional. Before he mastered rivals, he stabilized the machine that would let him outlast them. This patience is part of what made him dangerous. He was not simply aggressive, he was strategic. He let other rulers exhaust themselves in rivalries, while Babylon grew more coherent, more defensible, and more ready. Then, when the time was right, Hammurabi moved. Over the course of his reign, through warfare, alliances, and political opportunism, he brought major Mesopotamian rivals under Babylonian control. Sources describe how he forged coalitions among city-states, defeated opponents, and eventually ruled the whole of Mesopotamia from Babylon. This was not the work of a reckless warmonger. It was the work of a king who understood sequencing. He did not try to swallow the world on day one. He narrowed threats, shifted alliances, and waited for moments when his enemies were exposed. That is one reason Hammurabi became such a towering figure in the history of the ancient Near East. He was not merely stronger than others, he was more disciplined, more calculating. He turned Babylon into the center of a new political order, and once that happened, the city's identity changed forever. It was no longer just another Mesopotamian city. It was becoming Babylon, the name that would later echo through scripture, archaeology, empire, and legend. But conquest alone does not explain why Hammurabi still feels so alive thousands of years later. Many kings won wars. Many kings built walls. Hammurabi became immortal because he understood something deeper. Power lasts longer when it can be written. Near the end of his reign, the legal judgments associated with his rule were compiled into what we call the Code of Hammurabi, one of the most complete ancient law collections that survives. The famous stela, carved in dark stone, shows Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and patron of justice, receiving the symbols of authority. The image was political genius. It told every viewer that Babylonian law was not random, not private, not merely the whim of a ruler muttering from a throne room. It was presented as order sanctioned from above. Whether a citizen feared the king, trusted the courts, or believed in the gods, the message was the same. Babylon was a place where power claimed legitimacy and justice had been given visible form. The laws themselves reveal a society far more structured and self-aware than people often imagine when they hear the words ancient world. They dealt with trade, property, debt, labor, marriage, inheritance, injury, corruption, and civil life. They also reflected a stratified society in which penalties varied by social status, showing both the sophistication and the inequality of Babylonian life. This is important because Babylon was not legendary only because it was grand. It was legendary because it was organized. It projected an image of civilization with rules, ranks, procedures, and consequences. The city was becoming more than a political capital. It was becoming an idea that order could be imposed on chaos, that a ruler could bind a fractured land under a common authority, and that a city born in obscurity could claim to stand at the center of the world. That was the true beginning of Babylon's greatness. Not the later walls, not the Blue Gate, not the gardens people still argue about. Those would come much later. The first golden foundation of Babylon was built in the age when Hammurabi took a vulnerable city and taught it how to think of itself as destiny. Babylon had risen under Hammurabi with the force of a revelation. A city that had once been little more than a regional player now stood over Mesopotamia like a judge over a courtroom. Its king remembered not only for conquest, but for law, order, and the terrifying confidence that his rule reflected a cosmic design. But this is where ancient empires become painfully human. They can be built by genius and still be inherited by men who cannot carry the weight. The moment Hammurabi died, the future he had forged began to loosen. Not all at once, not dramatically at first. Empires rarely collapse in a single scream. More often they fray. Borders soften, rivals test the edges, tributaries hesitate, local loyalties reawaken. The illusion of permanence begins to crack, and what once looked like destiny starts to look like one king's extraordinary exception. Babylon had become the center of Mesopotamia, but keeping it there would prove far harder than lifting it there in the first place. His successors inherited the name, the throne, and the machinery of a powerful state, but not his precision. Over the generations, Babylon's grip weakened. The very land Hammurabi had united began to slip back toward fragmentation. New pressures emerged from outside, and old tensions inside Mesopotamia returned. In the 16th century BCE, the Hittites sacked Babylon in a strike so startling it must have felt like lightning from a clear sky. They did not stay to rule it, but the blow mattered. It shattered the aura of invincibility surrounding the city. Afterward, the Kassites rose to power and would rule Babylonia for centuries, bringing a long period of relative stability. But the old Babylonian age of explosive conquest was over. The city endured, and that alone is important. Babylon did not vanish with its first dynasty. It adapted. It survived transfers of power, foreign dynasts, changing elites, and the brutal logic of Mesopotamian politics. That survival is part of why Babylon became more than a kingdom. It became a civilizational anchor. Dynasties changed, yet Babylon remained Babylon. Its religious prestige, its cultural gravity, and its symbolic importance outlived the men who claimed to own it. And yet survival does not mean peace. Across the centuries, another power was growing to the north. Assyria, harder, more militarized, and eventually more relentless than any rival Babylon had yet faced. If Babylon represented prestige, scholarship, ritual, and ancient legitimacy, Assyria represented organized force sharpened into empire. The two were bound together by geography and culture, but they were also locked in a rivalry that would define the region for generations. Sometimes Assyrian kings took Babylon, sometimes Babylonian rulers resisted. Sometimes the relationship looked like alliance, vassalage, or uneasy coexistence. But under it all, there was a deeper tension. Assyria could conquer Babylon, but it could never fully replace it. Babylon possessed something swords alone could not manufacture: sacred prestige. To rule Mesopotamia without Babylon was incomplete. To hold Babylon by force was dangerous. The city was too important to ignore and too proud to remain quiet for long. By the 8th century BCE, Babylon was caught in a punishing cycle of local instability, tribal pressures, and imperial intervention. Chaldean groups, active in southern Mesopotamia, rose in influence and fed the turbulence. Assyria kept inserting itself into Babylonian affairs, sometimes claiming to restore order, sometimes clearly tightening the leash. On paper, Babylon still mattered enormously. In practice, it was increasingly vulnerable. Its throne became a prize others manipulated. Local elites maneuvered. Foreign rulers installed governors or client kings. Every attempt to stabilize the city seemed to create fresh resentments. Babylon was not just fighting enemies anymore. It was fighting for the right to remain itself. Then came Sennacherib, the Assyrian king whose name would become inseparable from one of the darkest chapters in Babylon's history. Before him, Assyrian rulers had often treated Babylon with a tense kind of respect. However self-serving, they understood that the city's sanctity mattered. They may have controlled it, but they hesitated to annihilate it. Sennacherib reached a breaking point. Babylon rebelled repeatedly. Local rulers conspired. Assyrian authority was mocked, challenged, and undermined. One Babylonian leader after another proved disloyal or useless from Nineveh's point of view. Sennacherib tried indirect control. He tried installing compliant figures. He tried the appearance of legitimacy. Again and again, Babylon resisted. The city seemed incapable of submitting quietly, and that may have enraged him more than outright military opposition. Babylon did not merely defy Assyria, it denied Assyria emotional satisfaction. It refused to stay conquered in spirit. So in 689 BCE, Sennacherib decided on something closer to vengeance than policy. He destroyed Babylon, not just defeated it, destroyed it. Temples were ravaged, walls were broken. Sacred spaces were violated. The city that had towered in the imagination of Mesopotamia was reduced to ruin in a way so shocking that even in a brutal age, it stood out. Ancient kings boasted often, but this was different. This was an act meant to erase not just a rebellion, but a memory. To flood the streets and wipe away the stubborn, sacred city that refused to stay obedient. Think about what that meant. Babylon, whose rulers had once spoken as if heaven and earth met in its temples, had now been broken so completely that its destruction felt cosmically obscene. The old, celebrated Babylon, the city whose greatness had begun with Hammurabi's age, had been brought low by an imperial enemy that saw destruction as the only remaining answer. But history has a strange sense of drama, and Babylon was not finished. In 681 BCE, only a few years after destroying the city, Sennacherib was assassinated by his own sons. To modern eyes, that looks like dynastic violence, the familiar bloodshed of ancient courts. To the people of Mesopotamia, it looked like judgment. Marduk, Babylon's great god, had not been powerless after all. The destroyer of Babylon had been struck down inside his own house. That interpretation mattered because in the ancient world, politics and theology were never really separate. A king's death could become a divine verdict. An empire's setback could become proof that the gods had shifted their favor. Sennacherib's end opened the door for one of the most remarkable reversals in the entire story of Babylon. His son, Esarhaddon, took a different path. Where the father had destroyed, the son restored. Babylon began to rise again, not instantly, not magically, but deliberately. Builders returned. Temples were repaired. Palaces were rebuilt. The city's sacred and political identity was reassembled piece by piece. This was not just construction. It was resurrection theater on an imperial scale. The message was unmistakable. Babylon had suffered, but Babylon would live. And here is where the central paradox of the city begins to sharpen. The Babylon whose ruins later ages would admire was largely this rebuilt city, the one restored in the 7th century BCE after Sennacherib's destruction. The physical Babylon that archaeology would uncover belonged mostly to a second life. But the emotional Babylon, the one that had already become legendary through centuries of memory, law, religion, and political prestige, belonged to the first. That gap between legend and stone is one of the most haunting things about Babylon. The city that people feared, praised, and mythologized had, in a sense, already died once. Its name survived the drowning of its earlier self. What rose afterward was both continuation and replacement, like a face rebuilt after fire. The restored Babylon carried old sacred meanings, old ambitions, old ceremonies, but it was also something new, laid down over trauma. A city remembering itself while physically becoming another version of itself. This is why Babylon feels so ghostly in history. It is never just one city. It is a sequence of Babylons, each inheriting the memory of the last. And waiting just beyond this resurrection was the man who would turn that second Babylon into the wonder the world still imagines when it hears the name. A king who would make the city blaze with color, monument, scale, and imperial ambition. A ruler under whom Babylon would become so magnificent that later generations would struggle to separate fact from legend. But before that golden radiance, there was ruin. Before the blue gate, there was floodwater. Before the lion-lined road, there was ash. And that is the truth Section 2 leaves us with. Babylon did not simply rise. It rose again, carrying inside its rebirth the memory of a prior death. If Babylon's earlier story was about survival, then this next chapter is about spectacle. Not the shallow kind, not decoration for decoration's sake, but spectacle as political language. Babylon had been destroyed, humiliated, and forced to prove that it still belonged at the center of the world. Then, in one of history's most dramatic reversals, It found the rulers who could turn recovery into magnificence. The first was Nabopolassar, the rebel who broke Assyrian control and made Babylon the capital of a new empire. After the death of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, Assyrian power weakened, and in 626 BCE Nabopolassar established himself as king of Babylon, laying the foundation of what historians call the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Under him, Babylon was no longer a battered, sacred city trapped inside someone else's empire. It was once again the command center of Mesopotamia. And after the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE, the old Assyrian giant was finished. Babylon had not only survived Assyria, it had outlived it. Then power passed to his son, Nebuchadnezzar II. And this is the moment when Babylon becomes the city most people picture in their minds. Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from about 605 to 562 BCE, was the greatest king of the Chaldean dynasty and the ruler who presided over Babylon at the height of its splendor. He inherited an empire, but he also inherited a city that still needed to embody imperial greatness in visible form. That distinction matters. Conquest gives a king territory. Architecture gives him immortality. Nebuchadnezzar seems to have understood this better than almost anyone in the ancient world. He did not just want Babylon to be powerful. He wanted it to look inevitable, to feel superhuman, to overwhelm the senses of anyone who entered it. The result was one of the most ambitious urban transformations of antiquity. Even later sources that exaggerated details were responding to something real. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar, was meant to stun. This is where the city's rebuilt identity takes on almost theatrical force. Nebuchadnezzar restored and expanded temples, palaces, walls, ceremonial roads, and gates, making Babylon not just a political capital, but a ritual stage on which empire could perform itself. One of the most important sacred structures was Etemenanke, the massive ziggurat associated in later tradition with the Tower of Babel. Ancient sources and later scholarship connect it to the sacred heart of Babylon, near the temple complex of Marduk, the city's chief god. Whether every later legend about it is accurate is less important than what the structure represented. A towering artificial mountain in a flat river plain, it declared that Babylon was the place where earth reached toward heaven. Livius notes that from certain approaches, its stacked gates and rising terraces could create the visual effect of a stairway into the sky. That image alone helps explain why later generations wrapped the structure in myth. In Babylon, religion and architecture did not merely coexist. They fused into a claim about cosmic centrality. But the most famous surviving symbol of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon is the Ishtar Gate. And even now, it feels almost unreal. Built around 575 BCE as the 8th fortified gate of the city, it stood on the main ceremonial approach and was decorated with glazed brick reliefs of dragons and bulls. The gate's deep blue surface was not simply painted, it was glazed to shine with a richness that made the structure look like something more precious than ordinary masonry. World History, Encyclopedia, and Britannica both note its vivid color and its relief decoration, while surviving reconstructions make clear just how startling it must have appeared to ancient eyes. Imagine a traveler approaching Babylon after weeks of dust, mud, and sunburnt roads, then suddenly seeing this wall of polished blue rising ahead like the edge of another world. That was not just beauty. That was domination through awe. The gate told every visitor before a single word was spoken. that Babylon was not built on the scale of ordinary cities, and the Ishtar Gate was only the beginning. Beyond it stretched the processional way, one of the great ceremonial roads of the ancient world. Archaeological remains and reconstructions show it lined with glazed brick lions, sacred animals associated with Ishtar. This was the route used during major religious festivals, especially the New Year celebrations, when the drama of kingship and divine order was publicly renewed. A processional road is easy to reduce to urban planning, but that misses the point. In Babylon, movement itself was choreographed. The city guided bodies, redirected eyes, and staged emotion. People did not just pass through it, they were handled by it. The road, the animals, the gate, the temples beyond, all worked together to produce a sequence of impressions that carried a political message. The king ruled by divine favor. Babylon stood under divine protection. Foreigners entering the city were not just crossing space, they were entering a story Babylon had written about itself. That is one of the most useful ways to think about Nebuchadnezzar's building program. He was not merely improving infrastructure, he was managing perception. He built walls and palaces, yes, but more importantly, he built emotional experiences. Livius and UNESCO both emphasize Babylon's centrality and monumental scale, and the broader archaeological record shows a city carefully shaped to project supremacy. This matters because imperial capitals are not only administrative centers, they are machines for manufacturing belief. They persuade subjects that resistance is futile, allies that attachment is advantageous, and rulers themselves that their power is part of the natural order. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a masterclass in that kind of persuasion. It converted wealth into brick, brick into symbolism, and symbolism into obedience. Then there is the most seductive mystery of all, the Hanging Gardens. Tradition long credited them to Babylon, often linking them to Nebuchadnezzar and, in later storytelling, to a Median wife for whom a mountainous green refuge was supposedly built in the flat heat of Mesopotamia. Britannica notes that by the 21st century, the site of the gardens had still not been conclusively established, and their exact form and even location remained debated. Some ancient writers describe terraced gardens near the royal palace, while modern scholars continue to argue over whether the gardens were in Babylon at all or confused with Assyrian monuments elsewhere. That uncertainty is part of their power. The Hanging Gardens may be the perfect Babylonian symbol because even in doubt, they magnify the city. Babylon became so associated with excess, ingenuity, and visual wonder that one of the 7 wonders of the world attached itself to its name, whether securely or not. Even the uncertainty feels on brand. Babylon was the kind of city that could generate myths convincing enough to survive alongside archaeology. And while later imagination sometimes turns Babylon into a fantasy skyline, the reality was already astonishing enough. UNESCO describes Babylon as one of the most influential ancient empire's central sites, and historical sources agree that under Nebuchadnezzar it stood at the height of its prestige. Wealth from empire flowed in. Temples were endowed. Monumental projects multiplied. The city became not merely a local capital but a political and cultural center, radiating influence across the Near East. This was also the Babylon that entered other people's memories with enormous force, including the Hebrew Bible, where Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns and the exile of Judah fixed Babylon in religious history as both conqueror and symbol. That matters because Babylon's greatness was not measured only in acres, walls, or glazed bricks. It was measured in how deeply it lodged itself in the minds of others. A truly great city does not only dominate territory, it colonizes imagination. So by the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Babylon had become what earlier rulers could only have dreamed of: a city rebuilt from trauma into majesty, a place where sacred ambition, imperial wealth, and architectural genius fused into one overwhelming image of power. But there is a danger hidden inside every golden age. When a city becomes too closely identified with one ruler's energy, one dynasty's prestige, one moment of triumph, decline can begin the instant that pulse weakens. And that is exactly what happened next. Babylon reached its most dazzling height under Nebuchadnezzar, but almost as soon as he was gone, the descent began. There is something almost cruel about how fast greatness can begin to unravel. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II looked unshakable. Its walls were colossal. Its temples gleamed. Its processional roads turned politics into theater. Its name echoed from Mesopotamia to the Levant. It had wealth, prestige, sacred authority, and the memory of victory. If you had walked through its gates at the height of its power, you might have assumed this city would stand forever. That is the illusion every great capital tries to create. Stone says permanence. Ceremony says order. Scale says destiny. But history has a way of slipping behind the performance and revealing how much depends on a single ruler's grip. And Babylon, for all its magnificence, was more fragile than it looked. The same empire that seemed to embody divine order was held together by conquest, tribute, elite loyalty, and the authority of one man whose presence made the whole machine appear stronger than it really was. The instant that presence vanished, the hidden weaknesses began to show. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, and with his death, the Neo-Babylonian Empire lost not just a king, but its center of gravity. This is a pattern we see again and again in ancient history. Founders and master builders often leave behind empires that look complete from the outside, but are unstable at the top. The court becomes more dangerous. Succession becomes uncertain. Ambitious men smell opportunity. Regional loyalties, kept quiet by fear or respect, begin to stir. Babylon had become so towering under Nebuchadnezzar that later rulers were forced to live in his shadow. That is rarely a comfortable inheritance. They had his palaces, his capital, his rituals, his imperial framework, but not his authority. Within just a few years, the throne changed hands repeatedly. Evil Merodach, also known as Amel-Marduk, ruled only briefly. Then came Neriglissar, then Labashi-Marduk, whose reign was so short it feels like a flicker. In less than a generation, the empire that had projected total command began to look like a house where the lights were still on, but everyone inside was fighting for the keys. This instability matters because empires are not merely collections of armies and cities. They are networks of confidence. As long as provincial governors, priests, military commanders, merchants, and subject peoples believe the center is strong, the empire breathes. The moment they begin to doubt, everything changes. Rumors become political forces. Hesitation becomes rebellion. Foreign enemies no longer see a giant. They see timing. Babylon still possessed its wealth and sacred prestige, but prestige without coherence can become ornamental. It shines, but it cannot hold the line. Then came Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon. and with him, the city entered its final strange phase as an independent imperial power. Nabonidus is one of the most intriguing figures in Babylon's story because he was not simply weak or unlucky. He was unusual. That may have been enough to doom him. He elevated the moon god Sin in ways that seemed to have alienated parts of Babylon's powerful priesthood, especially those tied to the cult of Marduk, the city's chief god. In a place like Babylon, where kingship and religion were fused together so tightly, this was not some side issue of personal spirituality. It cut into the symbolic heart of legitimacy. A Babylonian king was expected to serve the sacred order of Babylon itself. If influential groups felt that he was neglecting Marduk, then he was not merely making a theological mistake. He was loosening the bond between the throne and the city's identity. To make matters even more destabilizing, Nabonidus spent years away from Babylon in the Arabian oasis of Tema. Historians still debate all the motives behind this absence, but from the perspective of political theater, it was disastrous. Babylon was a city of ceremony. Presence mattered. Ritual mattered. The king's visibility mattered. A ruler who governed from afar risked seeming detached from the very sacred center he was meant to embody. In his absence, his son Belshazzar appears to have exercised royal power in Babylon, but deputy rule is not the same as undisputed kingship. The empire kept functioning, but something essential had been lost. Babylon no longer felt like the city of a ruler whose energy and ambition radiated from its core. It felt watched over, managed, preserved perhaps, but not fully inhabited by power. And while Babylon drifted into internal weakness, a new force was rising in the east with terrifying speed: Persia. Under Cyrus II, later called Cyrus the Great, the Persians were doing what all successful imperial powers do at the beginning of their ascent. Moving fast, absorbing territories, defeating rivals, and building momentum so quickly that neighboring states struggled to understand what was happening before it was too late. Cyrus defeated the Medes, expanded into Lydia, and emerged as the dominant power of the Near East. By the time Babylon fully had to reckon with him, Persia was no longer an emerging kingdom. It was an imperial machine moving with confidence and historical velocity. This is where Babylon's story becomes almost tragic, because the city still possessed extraordinary symbolic weight. It was still one of the great urban centers of the ancient world. It still carried the aura of sacred antiquity, but symbol and force had begun to separate. Babylon looked like the center of the world, while Persia was becoming the power that would actually rule it. That gap between appearance and reality is one of the most fatal conditions a state can enter. Once a capital begins living on accumulated greatness rather than renewed strength, it becomes vulnerable to a rival with sharper discipline and fresher purpose. In 539 BCE, Cyrus moved against Babylon. Later traditions, especially Greek accounts, loved dramatic details about the conquest, including stories of redirected rivers and surprise entry into the city. Some elements remain debated, but the essential fact is clear. Babylon fell to Cyrus with remarkable speed, and the Persian king presented himself not as a barbarian destroyer, but as a liberator and legitimate ruler. This was brilliant. Cyrus understood that to conquer Babylon was one thing, but to possess Babylon's prestige required another strategy entirely. He did not need to obliterate the city. He needed to inherit it. The Cyrus cylinder, famous as a royal inscription, presents him as a chosen ruler welcomed by Marduk, a king who restored order rather than desecrated it. Whether this was propaganda, sincere policy, or both, It shows how powerful Babylon's symbolic world remained. Even the man who conquered it had to speak Babylon's language of legitimacy. And that may be the most revealing moment in the whole section. Babylon fell, but not in the style of Sennacherib's earlier rage. It was not drowned in vengeance this time. It was absorbed, reframed, folded into a larger imperial order. That kind of fall is quieter, but in some ways more final. The city remained important under Persian rule. It still functioned. It still had wealth, temples, and people. But it was no longer the beating imperial heart of its own world. It had become a magnificent possession inside someone else's empire. For a while, Babylon retained privileges and a measure of autonomy. Life did not end the day Cyrus entered. Markets still moved. Priests still served. Bricks did not suddenly crumble into dust. That is how historical decline usually works. The city survives physically while losing something invisible first: initiative, sovereignty, the right to define the future on its own terms. Babylon had once forced neighboring kingdoms to respond to its will. Now it had to negotiate its place beneath Persian kings. Still, old pride does not disappear overnight. A city like Babylon carries memory in its rituals, its priesthood, its elite families, its streets, even in the stories people tell their children. The Babylonians had been a people of kings, walls, gods, and empire. Submission might be endured, but it would not be loved. And beneath the surface of Persian rule, resentment remained. Babylon had accepted conquerors before and then outlasted them. Perhaps some still believed the city could rise again, that Persia too would prove temporary, that Marduk would once more tilt history in Babylon's favor. But what came next would show that Babylon's final wound was not yet behind it. The city had survived destruction, rebirth, glory, and conquest. What it had not yet faced was the slow extinguishing of its sacred and political soul. That would come with revolt, Persian retaliation, and the moment when Babylon ceased to be not just an empire, but a living center of destiny. The final fall of Babylon did not happen in a single night. That is what makes it so unsettling. Cities like this do not simply vanish when a gate is broken or when a foreign banner rises above the walls. They die in layers. First, politically, then spiritually, then economically, then in memory. A city can still be inhabited, still hold markets, still host priests, still cast its shadow over the plain, and yet already be slipping out of history's center. That was Babylon after the Persian conquest. To the eye, it was still Babylon, still broad, still ancient, still heavy with the prestige of kings and gods. But beneath the surface, something essential had changed. It no longer commanded the world around it. It no longer shaped the age. It had become a masterpiece trapped inside someone else's empire, a lion kept alive, but collared. Under Persian rule, Babylon remained important for a time. That is what makes the end more tragic, because the city did not collapse from total neglect at first. It was still useful. It was still rich. Persian kings understood its prestige and made use of its administrative machinery. The city continued as a major urban center, and for a while that may even have fed the illusion that Babylon's grandeur could survive the loss of independence. But independence was not some decorative layer. It had been the pulse beneath everything. Babylon's rituals, its kingship traditions, its theological worldview, and its claim to cosmic centrality were all built on the assumption that this was not merely a city inside an empire. It was a city meant to stand at the center of one, Once that truth was gone, every ceremony became a little more hollow, every restoration a little more cosmetic, every day of survival a little more haunted by comparison with what had been. And still, Babylon remembered itself. That is the thing about old capitals. They carry their former greatness almost like muscle memory. Priests still served the old gods. Families still traced their identities through the city's institutions. Stories of Hammurabi, of Nebuchadnezzar, of Marduk's favor, of walls, gates, and processions all still lived in the minds of the people. They were subjects of Persia now, yes, but not blank subjects. They were Babylonians. The city had outlasted the Amorites, the Kassites, the Assyrians, and every disaster thrown at it before. Why not Persia too? Why should this empire be permanent when all the others had eventually bent or broken? That dangerous hope lingered in the city like heat in brick after sunset. So revolt came. In 484 or 482 BCE, depending on how the evidence is read, Babylon rose against Persian authority during the reign of Xerxes I. The details are fragmentary, and ancient political history often arrives to us through broken records and hostile later voices, but the broad truth is unmistakable. Babylon resisted, perhaps not with the old imperial strength of Nebuchadnezzar's day, but with something more desperate and more revealing: the refusal to fully surrender its identity. That is often the final act of a fallen great power. It cannot fully win, but it cannot bear complete submission either. It rebels not because the odds are good, but because memory itself becomes unbearable under foreign control. Xerxes crushed the revolt. That much is beyond doubt. What follows enters the zone where history and tradition interweave, but the result is clear enough. Babylon suffered devastating consequences. Its status declined sharply. Its sacred and political importance was cut down. Ancient traditions speak of the removal of the statue of Marduk, the city's great god, an act that was not merely theft, but symbolic amputation. In a city like Babylon, this mattered beyond words. Marduk was not just one deity among many. He was the divine center of Babylon's identity, the god around whom kingship, ritual, and sacred legitimacy had been organized for centuries. To remove his image was to declare that Babylon's old covenant with power had been broken. The city might still stand in brick and stone, but spiritually, something had been ripped out of its chest. This is why the Persian retaliation marks such a profound turning point. Sennacherib had once destroyed Babylon physically, and the city had risen again. But now the wound was deeper, because what was broken was not just the urban fabric, it was the city's role in the world. Babylon, after Xerxes, did not return as it had before. There was no second Nebuchadnezzar waiting in the wings. No new imperial dynasty rose to make the gates blaze again. No great revival turned the city back into the center of history. It remained, but as a diminished thing, and this is often how true endings work in civilization. Not a bang, not immediate disappearance, just the irreversible loss of momentum. The future begins happening elsewhere. Think of how painful that must have felt if you had lived there. To walk roads your ancestors once saw lined with lions and processions. To pass temples whose ceremonies had once affirmed the order of the cosmos. To know that foreign rulers now spoke the final word over your city. To remember, or hear from your grandparents, that Babylon had once humbled empires and made kings kneel. Greatness does not vanish politely. It lingers in comparison. Every lesser day becomes a reminder of what the city used to be. And yet, Babylon's final transformation into legend had already begun. Once a city loses its central role, imagination takes over. It becomes easier for later generations to exaggerate it, moralize it, mythologize it, and turn it into a symbol larger than any archaeological trench can contain. Babylon became many things at once. To some, it was the supreme city of ancient magnificence, the place of impossible walls, glittering gates, and wonder. To others, especially in later biblical and religious imagination, it became a symbol of pride, decadence, oppression, and doomed human ambition. The city's historical reality was immense enough to support both readings. Babylon really had been grand enough to astonish. It really had embodied imperial arrogance on a scale few cities could match. That dual legacy is part of why it remains so magnetic. Babylon was both masterpiece and warning. And now we come back to the paradox that opened this entire story. How could Babylon become a legend and turn to ruins before it was even founded? Because the Babylon people remember was never only one city. The Babylon of Hammurabi, the city that first rose to commanding greatness and established its legendary status, was destroyed, gone beneath violence and water. The ruins most people associate with Babylon belong largely to the later city, the Babylon restored after catastrophe and magnificently reshaped by Nebuchadnezzar II. So, the memory came first, the legend came first. The emotional Babylon, the sacred Babylon, the feared and admired Babylon had already entered history before the surviving ruins of its later body were laid down in their most famous form. In that sense, Babylon truly did become myth before it became archaeology. That is why Babylon feels different from other ancient cities. It is not just a site, it is an echo chamber of multiple lives, a small settlement that became a capital that became an empire that became a ruin that became a rebirth that became a wonder that became a possession that became a memory. And through all of it, the name endured. Babylon. Not because its walls survived unchanged, not because its kings ruled forever, but because few cities have ever burned themselves so deeply into the imagination of humanity. The bricks fell, the gods were carried away, the empire died, but the name did not. And maybe that is the final truth of Babylon. The greatest city in history did not defeat time. No city does. It did something stranger. It made time remember it.